Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. August 12th, 2025, Lancaster, California. A mother of three, Shayla Lisbeth Gutierrez Rocio, is reported missing. Her car is still parked at her apartment complex. Her cell phone lies inside. Her three children are accounted for. And yet Shayla is gone. Within days, that absence will be connected to a discovery in the Angeles National Forest that changes everything. What began as a local missing person call escalates into a full-scale international crime investigation. The first alert came just before noon on August 12th, when family members could not reach Sheila. She was 33 years old, known among her circle as a dedicated mother, balancing the daily demands of work and childcare. When her relatives dialed her number repeatedly, there was no response. For them, that silence was alarming. For investigators, it would soon mark the start of a high-priority case. Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputies arrived at the Lancaster residence within hours. What they found was unsettling, not because of what was obvious, but because of what was missing. The car she regularly used was still in the lot. Her phone was left behind, powered off. Inside the apartment, the layout looked normal at first glance, but closer inspection revealed what investigators later described as quiet anomalies. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered glass. But the routine items of daily life, a purse, medication, children's supplies, were all there. It was as if her life had been paused mid-sentence. In missing person cases, time is crucial. Within minutes of the initial call, deputies secured the apartment, canvassed nearby units, and requested surveillance footage from adjacent buildings. Neighbors recalled seeing Shayla the previous day, August 11th. None had noticed her leave that morning. There was no activity on her phone since late evening the night before. For investigators, the absence of activity was as important as anything they could see. No calls, no text messages, no social media logins. At this stage, law enforcement faced a critical question. Was this voluntary, or was it the beginning of foul play? Statistically, when a mother with dependent children disappears leaving behind her essentials, voluntary disappearance is considered low probability. Still, procedure demanded they log every possibility. By late afternoon, detectives extended the search radius. Patrol units checked local hospitals and shelters. Calls were placed to regional transit agencies. At 5 p.m., her details were entered into the missing persons database. No hits. By the evening briefing, the case was flagged for accelerated follow-up. The reasoning was clear, the risk profile was high, and the timeline already troubling. From a procedural standpoint, this was where the case shifted gears. A missing person report involving a vulnerable adult, especially a mother responsible for children, triggers higher response protocols. Detectives ordered preservation of digital evidence immediately. Cell site data requests were initiated. Financial institutions were contacted to flag any future activity on her accounts. Through the night of August 12th, deputies knocked on doors, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. One neighbor mentioned hearing movement in the hallway in the early hours, but could not identify specifics. Another noted that the family seemed strained in recent weeks, but did not elaborate. These fragments did not yet form a narrative, but each would later be measured against hard evidence. In the days that followed, the search expanded dramatically. Teams on foot, aided by air units, combed the desert outskirts north of Lancaster. Flyers went out with her photograph. Community groups began sharing her information across social media. And then, just 4 days later, the news broke. Remains were located deep inside Angeles National Forest. For investigators, the discovery confirmed their suspicions. This was no ordinary disappearance. What began as a welfare check had escalated into a homicide investigation, and the focus would now shift from search to forensic analysis. When the search team located human remains in Angeles National Forest, the investigation shifted immediately from a missing person file to a homicide case. For detectives, the body was no longer just evidence of death, it was the crime scene itself. What came next was a tightly sequenced process: recovery, transfer, forensic custody, and ultimately, the autopsy. At the scene, deputies preserved the area around the recovery site. Standard procedure required a forensic pathologist and the coroner's office to be notified before removal. By the time the remains were transported, every step had been logged. Chain of custody protocols ensured that from the forest floor to the county morgue, no evidence could be challenged as contaminated or mishandled. Forensic photographers documented the wrapping material around the body, capturing angles before any layers were cut or disturbed. Once at the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's facility, the body became the primary focus of examination. Identification was confirmed by fingerprint analysis and later reinforced through dental records. The name was now officially tied to the case file: Shayla Lisbeth Gutierrez Rosillo, age 33, mother of 3. The autopsy findings added detail to what had been, until then, only suspicion. Examiners noted sharp force trauma consistent with the use of a knife. No defensive wounds were recorded on the hands or forearms, suggesting the attack was sudden and likely offered little chance for resistance. Toxicology panels were run, as routine in homicide cases, but results did not alter the primary conclusion. The cause of death was classified as homicide by sharp force injury. Equally significant was the fabric wrapping the remains. Preliminary comparisons suggested similarity to common household materials. For investigators, this was a direct link between the domestic environment and the forest recovery site. Laboratory technicians cut controlled samples, placed them in sealed evidence bags, and logged them for trace analysis. Fibers, particulates, and any DNA present would be tested against samples later collected from Sheila's residence. This was not speculation. It was a controlled forensic bridge between one location and another. Inside the morgue, documentation was precise. Every injury was photographed with measurement scales. A forensic anthropologist noted that the skeletal remains showed no signs of old fractures or healed injuries beyond what was current, eliminating a history of hidden trauma. The evidence file would later be used in court to establish both the timeline and mechanism of death. For investigators, the autopsy was not just confirmation of foul play, it was a narrowing of possibilities. They now had a cause of death, a defined timeline, and physical materials linking the body to a probable origin. With these findings, the case could advance from recovery into the digital and financial domains of the victim's life, where movements and transactions often reveal truths the physical scene cannot. With the autopsy complete and the cause of death confirmed, investigators knew the case had reached a critical pivot. The next logical step was to trace the victim's digital footprint and financial activity. In 21st century homicide investigations, the absence of digital signals often speaks louder than activity itself. Detectives began by submitting emergency preservation requests to Shayla Cabrera's cell service provider. Logs showed her phone had been active until the late hours of August 11th. After that, there was a complete cessation: no outgoing calls, no incoming responses, no texts, and no social media sign-ins. Negative evidence of this kind is telling. For a woman whose routine included checking in with family, coordinating childcare, and keeping a steady digital rhythm, silence was not typical. The phone's last tower connection placed it in Lancaster, within range of her apartment. Parallel to phone analysis, the team requested security footage from the apartment complex and nearby businesses. Reviewing the time-stamped files, detectives noticed an image captured in the early hours of August 12th, a figure dragging a large wrapped object from the building. The quality was sufficient to establish a silhouette, though not immediately enough for positive identification. Investigators labeled it as preliminary evidence, pending further forensic enhancement. Financial records provided another layer. Shayla's bank account showed no withdrawals or charges after August 11th. Her debit card, often used for groceries and essentials, was inactive. Credit cards had not been touched. Investigators also cross-referenced utility accounts, checking for sudden anomalies. None appeared. This financial silence aligned too perfectly with the digital silence. One detective later noted, "The data aligned too cleanly." Sometimes that was the problem. When both financial and communication activities stop at the same moment, investigators interpret it as a disruption rather than coincidence. Attention then turned to travel records. Customs and Border Protection confirmed that within 2 days of Shayla's disappearance, a family member and 3 children had boarded a flight from Los Angeles to Lima, Peru. The departure was booked in advance but paid shortly before travel, raising procedural questions. Airline surveillance and passenger manifests were flagged for evidence. The U.S. Marshals and Interpol were contacted once the homicide ruling became official. Back at the crime lab, analysts compared the wrapping material from the forest recovery site to domestic items visible on surveillance footage. Still frames suggested a match with fabric documented leaving the Lancaster apartment. Technicians initiated fiber comparison testing, logging results under chain of custody protocols. Each detail built continuity. A woman last seen alive on August 11th, digital silence beginning the same night, financial inactivity that never resumed, and travel by close family out of the country immediately afterward. The digital and financial forensics did more than confirm timelines. They pointed investigators toward a path of escalation. What had begun as uncertainty was now becoming prosecutable evidence. The task ahead was to integrate this electronic trail with physical forensics already collected, creating a seamless narrative capable of withstanding courtroom scrutiny. The discovery at the Angeles National Forest had shifted the case from missing person to homicide, but investigators knew that to build a prosecutable crime theory, they had to step back and reconstruct the life of Sheila Cabrera. Victimology, in FBI parlance, is not just biography. It is the systematic examination of routine, vulnerabilities, and relationships that might intersect with crime. Sheila Lisbeth Gutierrez. Rosillo was 36 years old, a mother of 3 children under the age of 10, and a permanent resident in Lancaster, California. She balanced childcare with part-time employment and community connections, primarily among other Peruvian immigrant families in Los Angeles County. Those closest to her described her as cautious and reserved, not someone who disappeared voluntarily. Detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Homicide Bureau began conducting structured interviews with friends, co-workers, and family associates. Early interviews established a pattern. Sheila had not voiced plans to leave home, nor had she expressed intentions to travel. Investigators applied what they call the continuity of life test, checking banking activity, scheduled appointments, childcare commitments, and church attendance. The results were clear. Every indicator pointed to continuity abruptly cut off on August 12th. Financial investigators confirmed she had left behind her debit cards and ID. Her phone ceased transmitting after the evening of the 12th. Those findings were consistent with a forced interruption, not a voluntary disappearance. One detective put it plainly: people planning to walk away don't leave their ATM card on the kitchen counter. The escalation became evident when detectives began mapping the relational environment. By definition, victimology expands to examine intimate partners. In this case, Sheila's husband, Josimar Cabrera, was immediately noted. He was seen on surveillance footage moving materials later linked to the concealment of her body. But in Chapter 4, the focus is not on accusation. It is on documenting how investigators understood the victim's risk profile. The couple's relationship had known stressors. Interviews documented prior arguments over finances and childcare. Neighbors recalled verbal disputes audible from the street. None of these amounted to police reports, but victimology recognizes that underreporting is common in domestic environments. Detectives reviewed Lancaster station logs. There were no official calls for service tied to the Cabrera residence in the 12 months preceding the disappearance. That negative evidence, no 911 calls, no prior domestic incident reports, was carefully noted. Community sources described Sheila as family-oriented. Friends reported that her priority was the welfare of her children and her extended relatives in Peru. She sent remittances when she could. On August 11th, she had spoken with a cousin overseas, making plans for a future visit. That conversation, now part of the case file, underscored the improbability of voluntary disappearance. Forensic victimology also considers routines. Detectives established that Sheila typically handled school drop-offs, grocery shopping at a specific Lancaster market, and evening calls with relatives. Investigators traced her last confirmed activity, a message to a friend around 6:30 p.m. on August 12th. After that, digital silence. The timeline matched the point at which surveillance video captured suspicious movement at the residence. From a procedural standpoint, escalation occurs when investigative facts elevate the risk classification. Initially, the case was treated as a missing adult. By the 14th, with absence unexplained, escalation to critical missing person status occurred. By the 16th, with recovery of a body, the classification moved to homicide. Each escalation stage was documented in LASD logs, providing a clear procedural record for prosecutors. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted to provide risk assessment. Their preliminary assessment flagged the case as a high-probability intimate partner homicide, given the victim's age, parental status, lack of voluntary disappearance indicators, and the presence of concealment behavior. These factors align with national data. In the United States, nearly half of female homicide victims are killed by a current or former intimate partner. For investigators, the challenge was not just proving a homicide, it was articulating escalation in a way a jury could understand. Why was Shayla at risk? What made her vulnerable? Victimology gave that answer. She was tied to routines, committed to children, financially modest, without signs of fleeing. Her disappearance represented a rupture, not a choice. Detectives built out escalation chronologies. They charted when she failed to appear at a friend's gathering on August 13th. They noted the absence from school pickup. They recorded when family overseas could no longer reach her. Each missed obligation was documented as evidence of interruption. By August 20th, with extradition paperwork underway, prosecutors in Los Angeles had already inserted victimology into charging documents. It was not narrative flourish. It was forensic framing. The victim's stability made the homicide case stronger. A jury could be told, this was not a woman who vanished. This was a woman whose life was violently terminated. For law enforcement, escalation also meant resource reallocation. Detectives requested additional analysts from the Major Crimes Bureau. Search warrants were expanded to cover digital devices, financial accounts, and out-of-state travel records. Every escalation stage brought new procedural authority, broadening the scope of admissible evidence. Amid the sterile terminology, investigators acknowledged the human dimension. 3 children were now without their mother. They had been transported across international borders and later recovered into protective custody. In victimology, dependents are considered secondary victims. The trauma they endured reinforced the stakes of the case. One homicide sergeant summed it up. When you map victimology, you're not just cataloging biography, you're documenting why the system must act. That sentiment resonated with the broader community. For immigrant families in Los Angeles County, the case was a chilling reminder of how quickly a domestic conflict could escalate to lethal violence. Escalation in procedural terms is dry, but behind every escalation code is a human loss. Shayla's routines, abruptly terminated, told the story of her death as clearly as any forensic sample. As the investigation advanced, escalation also meant looking outward. The case had crossed international boundaries. Detectives liaised with the U.S., Marshal Service, Interpol, and Peruvian authorities. Each agency entry reflected a higher level of escalation, shifting the case from local homicide to international pursuit. By August 22nd, with charges filed and an extradition request submitted, escalation reached its peak. What began as a local missing person call in Lancaster had become an international criminal proceeding. The lesson embedded in victimology was stark. When continuity of life breaks abruptly, investigators must escalate fast. Delay risks losing children, evidence, and ultimately, justice. By the 3rd week of August 2025, the homicide file of Shayla Lisbeth Gutierrez Rosillo had shifted from local sheriff's notes to a case dossier intended for prosecution. Escalation was complete. The missing person narrative had been replaced by a murder charge. Now came the procedural challenge of constructing a charging theory solid enough to stand in court and durable enough to survive the international complexities of extradition. In Los Angeles County, homicide prosecutions begin with evidence review by the District Attorney's Special Trials Division. Detectives delivered digital logs, surveillance images, and forensic summaries to prosecutors on August 20th. The legal question was direct but demanding. Could the state prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Shayla was killed and that her husband, Josimar Cabrera, was responsible? The foundation rested on 3 categories of evidence. First was surveillance video from Lancaster, showing Josimar moving materials from the residence to his vehicle. Those same materials, plastic sheeting and cord, matched what investigators recovered near the Angeles National Forest ravine where Shayla's body was found. That was preliminary physical correlation. Second was the negative digital trail. Shayla's phone went dark after the evening of August 12th. For prosecutors, that gap was not mere absence. It was circumstantial evidence of foul play. When combined with her halted banking activity and missed obligations, it created a narrative of involuntary disappearance. Third was concealment behavior. The body was wrapped in manufactured material linked to the household. Jurors are instructed that concealment can indicate consciousness of guilt. Prosecutors considered this a central point. The concealment effort was not random, it was deliberate. The challenge was extradition. By August 22nd, Josimar Cabrera was believed to be in Peru, having crossed international borders with the couple's 3 children. Prosecutors drafted the charging document not only to meet California standards, but also to satisfy Peruvian legal thresholds for extradition. That meant aligning the U.S.'s charge of murder with equivalent provisions under Peruvian penal law. To do this, the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office consulted the U.S. Department of Justice's Office of International Affairs. They verified that the U.S.-Peru extradition treaty allowed for surrender in homicide cases. Still, every word in the charging theory had to survive scrutiny in 2 jurisdictions. Detectives tightened chain of custody records. Every item recovered near the Angeles National Forest site was logged, bagged, and signed. For the extradition package, those logs mattered. A defense attorney abroad could argue that evidence was mishandled. Prosecutors knew the chain had to be airtight. The charging theory also had to address potential defenses. What if the suspect claims Shayla left voluntarily and died accidentally? Prosecutors countered that theory with victimology. No evidence of voluntary disappearance, no preparation for travel, and absolute silence in digital life. What if the suspect claimed the death was not homicide but misadventure? The counter was concealment. Accidental death is not followed by concealment in forest ravines. To reinforce the case, prosecutors relied on forensic pathology. The autopsy confirmed homicidal violence, though details remained sealed for trial. What mattered was classification. Cause of death consistent with homicide, not accident. That confirmation allowed prosecutors to draft a charging document with confidence. Interagency strategy was now essential. The district attorney's office coordinated with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, and Interpol. A red notice was requested, the highest form of international alert. That notice would flag Josimar Cabrera in every airport database under Interpol jurisdiction. The U.S. Marshals Service also entered the case. Their fugitive task force specializes in cross-border pursuit. In practice, it meant aligning resources to track not only a fugitive father, but also 3 children placed at risk. Children are not evidence, but their transport is fact. Fact builds narrative. Narrative secures extradition. The charging theory also required prosecutors to humanize the case. In filings, Shayla was not just a name. She was a mother of 3, a lawful resident, a woman with stable routines. The more stable the victim appears, the stronger the prosecution argument that her disappearance and death were not voluntary. Jurors in Los Angeles and officials in Peru alike would read those words. A senior prosecutor summarized the approach. We don't have to tell the jury who Shayla was in every detail. We have to show them why she would not be gone unless someone made her gone. That single line guided the structure of the charging brief. Procedurally, prosecutors sought a charge of murder with special circumstance, concealment and flight. That classification permitted higher sentencing ranges under California law. It also underscored to Peruvian authorities that this was not a domestic dispute gone wrong. It was a calculated act with international dimensions. By August 22nd, the charging package was filed. That date mattered. In extradition cases, delays weaken leverage. Filing within 10 days of the body's recovery showed urgency, competence, and resolve. The interagency process was not just legal, it was symbolic. For immigrant families in Los Angeles, seeing U.S. authorities move swiftly across borders signaled that justice was not bound by geography. The crime scene may have been in California, but the reach of the case extended to Lima. As the charging theory solidified, detectives reflected on the broader implications. Homicides within domestic spheres are tragically common, but few evolve into international manhunts. That escalation made every procedural choice significant. The bridge forward was clear. With charges filed and extradition requested, the next step would involve not just evidence but diplomacy. Could the United States bring Josimar Cabrera back to California? Could the voices of Shayla's family be heard in a courtroom thousands of miles away? By the last week of August 2025, the disappearance of Shayla Lisbeth Gutierrez Rosillo was no longer a missing person file. It was a homicide prosecution, with the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office moving quickly to secure charges against her husband, Josimar Cabrera. The evidence, surveillance video, forensic materials recovered near the Angeles National Forest, and digital records showing her sudden silence was strong enough to sustain a murder count. But the case presented an unusual obstacle. The suspect had already left the country taking the couple's 3 children and flying to Peru. That single fact turned a straightforward domestic homicide into an international crime requiring diplomatic coordination and patience. Inside the Los Angeles Superior Court, prosecutors outlined the foundation of their case. The timeline was clear. Sheila vanished August 12th, her phone stopped registering any activity, and within hours, her husband was seen moving bulky, wrapped items from their home. By August 16th, search teams recovered remains later confirmed to be hers. By August 20th, the murder charge was filed. On August 22nd, the extradition request was transmitted. The record contained no gaps, an essential feature if defense counsel later tried to exploit procedural weakness. Chain of custody was emphasized at every stage. Every swab, fiber, and video clip was logged with signatures and timestamps. Prosecutors knew that extradition cases often involved defense challenges over handling or contamination. Anticipating this, investigators kept the documentation unusually strict, building a file that could withstand scrutiny both in California and in a foreign court. In the hearings that followed, the prosecution presented 3 central arguments: opportunity, forensic linkage, and flight. Sheila was last seen with her husband. The materials wrapped around her body matched supplies linked to him, and his immediate departure with the children signaled consciousness of guilt. Together, those points formed a narrative that jurors could follow cleanly when trial eventually began. Yet trial could not begin without the defendant. Under treaty obligations, Peru can return suspects for homicide prosecution, but only after its own judiciary rules on the extradition request. That process can take months or longer. While California prosecutors prepared their case as if a jury were imminent, they also understood that the calendar now depended on a court thousands of miles away. In the meantime, the children were returned safely to the United States and placed under court-appointed guardianship. Their well-being was not the direct subject of the homicide case, but the court acknowledged that their voices could eventually matter, either as witnesses or as part of victim impact statements, if conviction occurred. Legal analysts noted that this was a prosecution both open and shut and maddeningly delayed. The forensic record left little ambiguity, yet the absence of the accused meant the proceedings remained half-finished. For Sheila's family, the hearings offered validation that her case was being pursued, but not yet the closure of seeing a defendant seated before a jury. By late August, the situation was fixed. Charges filed, evidence secured, extradition requested. What remained uncertain was the timeline of justice. The courtroom in Los Angeles stood ready, but the next move rested with international law. The moment prosecutors confirmed that Sheila Cabrera's death was being treated as a homicide, the story left the confines of court filings and entered the national conversation. Reporters stationed outside the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office relayed every new detail, framing the case as both a tragedy of domestic violence and a test of cross-border justice. Television packages focused on the striking timeline: a mother of 3 vanishing on August 12th, her body recovered only days later in the Angeles National Forest, and her husband fleeing with the children before charges were announced. The clarity of the sequence gave the public a narrative easy to follow, but the implications behind it, spousal homicide, concealment, international flight, made it impossible to ignore. Family members of Sheila allowed selective interviews, careful not to interfere with ongoing proceedings. They emphasized her devotion to her children, her steady presence in the community, and the disbelief that her life could end in such calculated violence. For viewers, these portraits transformed a case file into the story of a recognizable person, a mother who had birthdays planned, meals to cook, and a future that was abruptly taken. Journalists highlighted the forensic trail, but in terms accessible to the public. The matching of material wrapped around the remains to items linked to the household was described as a physical fingerprint of guilt. Her phone's sudden silence and absence from digital platforms, so unusual for a woman who texted her relatives daily, was portrayed as a chilling break in modern patterns of life. Even casual audiences understood. Silence itself had become evidence. Public attention quickly turned to the international angle. With Josimar Cabrera believed to be in Peru, many asked whether the United States would ever see him inside a California courtroom. Extradition treaties were explained on nightly news programs, with legal analysts noting that Peru had honored homicide extraditions before but often after long procedural battles. For Shayla's relatives, that meant waiting not for evidence to be found, it already was, but for bureaucracy to move. The community of Lancaster held vigils. Neighbors lit candles, organized donations for the children, and spoke openly about the need to recognize warning signs of domestic violence. Pastors, civic leaders, and advocates used the case as a rallying point. If something could happen so suddenly, in a family that appeared intact, then silence from victims or hesitation from friends could no longer be ignored. In towns across Los Angeles County, the name Sheila became a reference not only to a crime, but to a call for vigilance. Media coverage also pressured officials. The district attorney's office was aware that every delay in extradition was being tracked publicly. Officials stressed that the children had been safely returned, but they could not promise when or if the suspect would face a jury. Reporters pressed, would California pursue the case even if it required years of negotiation? Prosecutors answered cautiously but firmly, yes. Legal scholars debated the evidentiary weight of the case. The combination of surveillance footage, forensic linkage, and digital silence was considered strong. But without the defendant in custody, these strengths remained suspended. Commentators pointed to other cases where suspects had remained abroad for years, warning that persistence alone does not always translate to resolution. For many viewers, the resonance of the case was not only legal, but personal. Domestic violence advocates stressed that Sheila's story was not isolated. It reflected a broader pattern in which women are most at risk from partners within their own homes. Statistics were cited, but what held attention was the tangible example. 3 children, suddenly without a mother, because warning signs may have gone unseen or unspoken. The case also revealed something about modern true crime coverage itself. With constant media attention, the line between informing the public and saturating it grew thin. Audiences demanded updates, but prosecutors had to keep elements of evidence sealed to preserve trial integrity. That tension left space for speculation online, with social media users dissecting each filing, each statement, sometimes blurring fact with assumption. Investigators quietly noted that such speculation could complicate jury selection in the future. By late August, the coverage had settled into a rhythm. Updates on extradition, reflections from advocates, and reminders from authorities that the case remained open. For the family, this meant living with their grief in public view, their private tragedy discussed nightly on television and dissected across digital platforms. Some welcomed the attention, believing it kept pressure on officials. Others found it unbearable. The weight of public interest underscored one truth. Sheila's death was not only a matter of evidence and indictments, but a collective reckoning about safety in the most intimate of relationships. That is what gave the case such reach. It was at once specific and universal. Media scrutiny closed with the same unresolved note that hung over the entire case. The children were safe, the charges were filed, the evidence cataloged, but the defendant was absent and justice was delayed. For a community that had turned grief into vigilance, the question remained whether the system would ever deliver the final act of accountability. By late August 2025, Los Angeles prosecutors had completed their case. Surveillance footage, matching materials, and digital records tied directly to Sheila Cabrera's disappearance. The file was strong, but the accused, her husband, Josimar Cabrera, was already across borders, believed to be in Peru. The district attorney filed murder charges and issued an extradition request. The 3 children had been safely returned to California, but the suspect remained out of reach. Extradition is slow. Every report and affidavit must be translated and presented before a Peruvian court. Until that process concludes, the case cannot reach trial. For Sheila's family, the timeline is etched. Missing on August 12th, remains located on August 16th, charges filed days later. What is missing is accountability. The evidence is clear, yet justice waits on international cooperation. The human impact remains deeper than any log entry. Sheila was a mother of 3. The loss reshaped a household forever. Her children will grow up marked by both grief and the unresolved status of their father. As of August 26, 2025, murder charges are filed, extradition is pending, and the suspect remains a fugitive abroad. The cases pause between forensic certainty and courtroom resolution. This crime shows how even when the truth is established, justice can be delayed. And it asks a larger question: should nations act faster when lives and entire families hang in the balance? As I close this case, I can't help but think about how fragile safety really is. Sheila's story reminds us that crime doesn't just end with evidence. It leaves lasting wounds on families and communities. It makes me ask, how do we better protect the vulnerable before tragedy strikes? What do you believe should change? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear where you're watching from. And if this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.